It happened in less than 10 seconds. The door creaked open just as the morning sun struggled to cut through the heavy southern mist. The man who stepped inside didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than the footsteps echoing against the tile. Black skin. Worn flannel, scuffed boots, no badge. No name tag, just presence. A presence that, in this town, was enough to provoke. "Hey, what the hell do you want?" A voice snapped from across the lobby. Before the man could answer, it happened. The spit came fast. Wet, direct, unprovoked. It hit his cheek with a sickening sound. More than saliva, it was centuries of assumption weaponized in a single, arrogant act. The white officer, maybe in his late 30s with a beer belly under his Kevlar vest and smugness aged like tobacco smoke, didn't blink. "You people always wandering into places you don't belong," he muttered. The room did nothing. No gasp, no pushback. Just the dry scratch of a fan overhead and the faint murmur of a coffee pot somewhere in the back. The black man didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his back pocket, slowly, as if defusing a bomb, and wiped the spit with a cloth so clean it looked almost ceremonial. Then he met the officer's eyes. Not everyone who walks through these doors is lost. Some come to lead, but they didn't hear it, not yet, because in their eyes, he was no one. What no one in that room knew, not the officer who spit, not the ones who laughed, not the receptionist who kept her head down, was that this man was James Carter, a 24-year veteran of federal law enforcement, a man who'd spent the last decade rooting out corruption from precincts far more dangerous than this one, and as of 7 a.m. this very morning, he was the new chief of police of Little Pines, Georgia, and he had walked in that door with a plan. Not to punish, not to grandstand, but to watch. To see what power did when it thought no one was looking, and what he saw in those first 10 seconds was everything he needed to know. Before anyone in Little Pines knew his name, before any badge gleamed under the courthouse lights, before a single press photo was taken, James Carter had already arrived. Not with sirens, not with salutes, but with silence and purpose. He didn't walk into the police department that morning to be recognized. He came to see who they were when they thought no one was watching. Because James Carter understood something most men in power forget. Real culture isn't in the rule book. It's in the moments no one expects to be recorded. And what James had learned in 2 decades of service, from the cold walls of federal interrogation rooms to backdoor task force meetings at the FBI, was that corruption doesn't always wear a scowl. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it calls you "sir" with a loaded tone. Sometimes it laughs while looking the other way, and Little Pines, Georgia, had that kind of smile. For months, the town's police department had made headlines in small, quiet ways. Complaints that went nowhere. Body cameras that malfunctioned. A local preacher's teenage son left bleeding after a routine stop. On paper, they read like isolated incidents. But James Carter knew better. He read between the lines, the silences in the reports, the redacted names, the patterns that reeked of something rotten just beneath the surface. And when the offer came for him to take over as police chief, he didn't hesitate. He also didn't announce himself. Instead, he asked for 1 week. No formal welcome, no press. No announcement, just access. He showed up wearing a plaid flannel shirt, jeans softened by time, and boots scuffed at the toe. A plain ball cap tugged low enough to hide the fire in his eyes. It wasn't a costume, it was camouflage. Because James Carter wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to find the ones who thought they could get away with it. and as he crossed the department's parking lot that humid morning, he carried nothing but a folded handkerchief in his back pocket and 20 years' worth of instincts in his chest. He saw the smirks, the whispers, the casual exclusion, the way officers nodded to each other but looked through him. Perfect. That was exactly what he needed. This wasn't a man driven by ego. James Carter didn't need the room to know his rank to command authority. He carried it in his stillness, in the way he observed more than he spoke, in the heaviness of his silence, like a storm cloud waiting to break. But beneath that calm was a storm long in the making. Because James Carter had grown up in towns like Little Pines, he knew what it meant to walk into rooms where you weren't supposed to belong. He remembered his father being pulled over in front of their house and made to sit on the curb while neighbors watched. He remembered his older brother arrested at 17 for fitting a vague description and spending a weekend in jail before anyone admitted the mistake. And he remembered the day he put on the uniform for the first time, not because he believed the system was fair, but because he wanted to be inside it when it wasn't. He wasn't naive, he was strategic. And now, as chief of police, he had the chance to lead a department from the inside out. But first, he needed to know what kind of sickness lived inside these walls. So when Officer Mike Dunham stepped forward with contempt in his eyes and spat in James's face, Carter didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even raise his voice. He just blinked. Slowly, letting the act sink in like a signature on a confession. "You just showed me everything I needed to know," he thought. "And you did it for free." And that's when James Carter smiled, not out of amusement, but out of certainty, because justice was no longer coming. It had already walked in the door. The door clicked shut behind him with the kind of finality that didn't need a lock. Inside the Little Pines Police Department, time moved differently. Not slow, but stale. The kind of staleness that settles into places where no one expects to be challenged. The tiles underfoot were polished but lifeless, the fluorescent lights above too bright, as if overcompensating for the shadows no one wanted to name. The air reeked of burnt coffee and something deeper, complacency. It wasn't a large station, just a central hallway flanked by glass-walled offices, a break room that smelled of microwaved regret, and a duty desk cluttered with yesterday's paperwork. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in insulation. The place had the feel of a private club, where the jokes never changed and neither did the faces. Laughter bounced off the walls. Not the kind that invited you in, but the kind that told you, "You don't belong here." Near the break room, 3 officers leaned back in their chairs, boots propped on desks, chuckling over something that involved too many curse words and too little professionalism. One of them mimicked someone's accent. Another whistled a tune that didn't match the moment. Behind the front desk, a woman in uniform typed without ever looking up. No one noticed him. Or maybe they did, and chose not to care. James Carter didn't need to be greeted to understand what kind of place he'd stepped into. He already knew. Because this was the real department, the version they never showed at press briefings or award ceremonies. This was the unfiltered, unsupervised culture that flourished when power forgot it had a purpose. And that's exactly what he came for. He moved slowly, deliberately, eyes scanning, ears open. He noted the faded Honor Integrity Service plaque crooked on the wall. A cracked coffee mug that read, "Complainers get overtime." A wrinkled flyer for a community outreach program no one in the room had likely ever attended. And then, from somewhere behind him, a voice cut through the air like a rusted blade. "Hey. You lost, old man?" The laughter died down just enough to let the insult hang. James stopped, turned slightly. His face gave nothing away. Inside, he was already filing away names, expressions, tone. Another voice followed, lower, sharper, this time with an edge of challenge. "This ain't a soup kitchen, brother. You best head out before someone calls real law enforcement." The words weren't said in anger. They were said with habit. That was worse. James Carter didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because in a few minutes, the men laughing now would be sitting upright, adjusting their collars, realizing too late that the stranger they dismissed was the very man they'd soon have to salute. And all of it, the voices, the smirks, the culture, was now on record, not on tape. But in the mind of a man who had come not just to lead, but to cleanse. "Hey, you deaf or just stupid?" The voice came from the left, sharp, slow, cocky. It sliced through the air like a box cutter through cheap fabric. James Carter turned, calmly. Quietly. The man striding toward him wore his badge like a weapon and his belt like a trophy case. Officer Mike Dunham, mid-30s, red-faced, stocky, with a swagger that had never been questioned. His nameplate gleamed, but the sneer on his face said more about who he was than any polished brass ever could. Behind him, a few officers chuckled, low, knowing. The kind of laugh that didn't need a punchline. In places like this, it wasn't about the joke. It was about the hierarchy, about reminding someone of their place. At that moment, Mike Dunham believed he was speaking down to someone. "You're in the wrong building, old man," Dunham said, stepping closer, "unless you're looking for the shelter, or maybe you're just here to clean the toilets." Laughter again, louder this time. A slapping sound from a desk, a half-choked coffee spit. Someone muttered, "We got another one wandering in off the street." James stood still. His body didn't tighten. His shoulders didn't square up. But inside, the machine began to record. Not in anger, but in purpose. "You need to take that mess somewhere else," Dunham added, his voice rising like he was performing now for his audience. And then, without warning, it happened. One step closer, one long, deliberate inhale, and Dunham spat. Wet, hot, direct. The spittle struck James just below his eye and slid slowly, grotesquely down his cheek. Time fractured into shards. You could hear the drip before you heard the room react. One officer burst into laughter so loud it echoed off the walls like gunfire. Another slapped the filing cabinet and doubled over. A third whispered, "God damn," like he'd just watched a magic trick. No one moved to stop it, because no one believed the man standing there was worth stopping for. But James Carter didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a badge or a threat or a courtroom promise. He just reached slowly into his back pocket, pulled out a clean white handkerchief, folded it once in his hand, and wiped his face. Deliberate, dignified, like a surgeon prepping for something much bigger than what had just happened. Then, only after the last laugh had faded into silence, he spoke. "Is this how you treat people?" The words were soft, but they hit the room like a gavel. Dunham paused. The grin on his face didn't fade, but something in his eyes flickered, a glitch. The first sign that maybe the show had gone too far, but pride wouldn't let him retreat. "Only the ones who don't belong," he answered mockingly. Behind him the others chuckled again, but it wasn't as loud this time. One of them shifted in place. Another scratched the back of his neck. James let the silence swell, not with rage, but with weight. He didn't retaliate, didn't defend himself, because this moment wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation. This was how they acted when they thought no one important was watching. This was what power looked like without accountability. At that moment, James Carter understood something more important than what had just happened to him. They had just revealed everything he needed to see, and they didn't even know it. So he turned, quietly, calmly, his boots echoing down the hallway as he walked toward the precinct's main office. Behind him, the laughter sputtered. The spell had been broken. Something felt wrong now, off, unsettled. And soon, Officer Mike Dunham and everyone else in that room would realize they hadn't spit on a homeless man. They had spit on the chief of police of Little Pines, Georgia, and that realization would land harder than any fist ever could. The intercom crackled overhead, thin and static warped. "All personnel, report to the briefing room. Mandatory attendance." The voice of Captain Simmons was unmistakable. Authoritative, routine. Still, the hallway buzzed with half-hearted motion. Chairs scraped back, conversations paused mid-sentence, and the officers who had just been laughing now shuffled into the conference room like students at a school assembly, bored, unbothered, and blissfully unaware of what was about to happen. Mike Dunham leaned against the wall near the back, arms crossed, smirk still firmly in place. His buddies flanked him, sipping burnt coffee from department mugs, the taste familiar and the mood still light. "That guy earlier," someone muttered between chuckles, "looked like he hadn't had a shower in a week." Another scoffed. "Should have called code 5150. Mental case for sure." The room was filled with bodies and bravado. What it lacked was awareness. They didn't see the man enter through the side door. Not at first. James Carter stepped in without announcement, without sound, just a steady walk and a leather folder in his left hand, bearing the gold-embossed seal of the Georgia State Police Department. His plaid shirt was still faintly damp where the spit had landed minutes before, but he walked like it didn't matter, because it didn't. Not now. He moved along the edge of the room, deliberately staying out of view, eyes scanning the faces. His officers, who still didn't know who he was. Not yet. At the front, Captain Simmons adjusted his collar and cleared his throat. "All right, settle down, folks," he said, his voice carrying over the room like a judge calling order. "We've got something important this morning." The laughter faded. Postures straightened. Even Dunham, sensing a shift in tone, lowered his arms and stood a little taller. "As most of you know," Simmons continued, "Chief Walker retired last month after 23 years. The department's been waiting for news, and today, it's official." The room leaned in, curiosity piqued. "I'm pleased to introduce the new Chief of Police for Little Pines. A man with an impeccable record, decades of service at the federal level, and a reputation for reform that's earned him more than a few enemies in high places." Some heads turned. A few eyebrows lifted. "And I have no doubt," Simmons added, "he'll make an impression here, too." He paused for effect. Then, with a motion toward the corner, "Please welcome Chief James Carter." The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was catastrophic. The kind of silence that undoes everything said in the room before it. The laughter died instantly. Coffee mugs froze mid-sip. Eyes widened, jaws slackened. Officer Mike Dunham's mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. His smirk evaporated like breath on cold glass, and color drained from his face in slow, visible waves. Because there he was. The same man he'd insulted. The same man he'd spat on. The same man he'd told to leave. Now standing at the front of the room. With authority. With presence. With every eye locked on him. James Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply stepped forward, placed the folder on the podium, and scanned the room. One face at a time. When his eyes met Dunham's, he held the gaze for just a second too long. Long enough for everyone in that room to feel the weight of the unspoken truth. They hadn't just embarrassed themselves. They had exposed themselves. "Good morning," Carter said, his voice steady, smooth as a blade unsheathed. "My name is James Carter. As of today, I'm your new chief of police." Not a sound. Not a cough. Not a chair creak. Not even the hum of the AC could mask the tension now. It wasn't just silence. It was the consequence. And in that moment, every officer in that room realized what had felt like just another joke. It was about to change everything. James Carter stood at the podium without rush, without fanfare, just stillness. The kind of stillness that didn't ask for attention, but demanded reckoning. He placed both hands on the edge of the lectern. No notes, no script, only memory. And in his memory, the sting of fresh spit had already dried. He let the silence stretch, just long enough for discomfort to settle in every seat. Then he began. "This morning," James said, his voice even, smooth, almost quiet, "I didn't walk into a department of law and order." He paused. Eyes scanned the room again. "I didn't see a team of professionals. I didn't see justice. I saw a farce, a performance." The word hit like a slap in slow motion. Nobody moved. "I saw a place where power hides behind laughter, where arrogance passes for tradition, where respect isn't given unless someone earns it with their appearance." In the back, someone shifted in their seat. A cough died in the throat. Even the lights seemed to hum quieter now. James leaned in slightly, not to get louder, but to get closer. "Let me be perfectly clear," he continued. "What I witnessed was not an isolated mistake. It was a pattern, a culture, one that mocks the badge you wear and the people you're sworn to serve." His words were scalpel precise. Not a syllable wasted, not a moment of theatrics, because this wasn't a performance. It was the diagnosis. "You don't have to like me," he said, straightening. "You don't even have to agree with how I got here. But you will respect the uniform you wear, and the people you protect, because if you don't, you won't wear it much longer." The message was clean, direct. No raised voice, no vengeance, just the unmistakable sound of a new era sharpening its edge. Then he paused, letting the words sink in like rain into dry earth. "What I saw today was more than disrespect. It was an infection. And if you're not ready to be part of the cure, you're part of the rot." He stepped back. No mic drop, no applause. Just silence. The kind that followed truth into a room that had no more lies left to hide behind. James Carter stepped down from the podium with the slow gravity of a man who knew every step was being watched and judged. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He walked through the silence like it was fog, parting the room not with force but with presence. Every officer turned as he moved, and when he stopped, just feet away from Mike Dunham, the temperature in the room dropped by degrees. Dunham stood rigid, arms crossed, trying to resurrect the smirk that had carried him through every joke, every slap on the back, every night at the bar where lines blurred and power puffed up like smoke. But now, the smirk cracked, the arms loosened, his eyes darted, then landed on the floor. James looked straight at him, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous: clarity. "Officer Dunham," he said, his voice low, deliberate, "you didn't just spit on me." The room tensed. Breathing slowed. The walls themselves seemed to lean in. "You spit on the honor of this entire industry. On the badge you wear, on the oath you took, and on every single person who's ever tried to do this job with integrity." It wasn't a confrontation. It was a verdict, delivered not in a courtroom, but in the very room where the culture had festered too long, unchallenged. What you did wasn't just indecent. It was revealing. You showed everyone here what happens when power believes it's protected, when ego replaces duty. Dunham opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught, suspended in his throat like a failed defense. James stepped 1 inch closer, not threatening, but undeniable. "You didn't know who I was," he said. "And that's exactly the problem. You didn't think you needed to know. You didn't care." A murmur spread through the room, not words, but unease. The recognition of something exposed, something rotten. "You looked at me," James continued, "and assumed I didn't matter, that I could be insulted, dismissed, dehumanized because I didn't fit your idea of who belongs here." He let the moment breathe, let the mirror hang in front of every face. "And that assumption? That's why this department has lost the trust of the people it's supposed to serve." That final line cracked the room open like a hammer on stone. It wasn't loud, but it was final. Dunham stood still, but he wasn't standing tall anymore. He was shrinking beneath the weight of the truth. And for the first time in a long time, the uniform he wore looked too big for him. The room wasn't silent anymore. It was stunned. Not from noise, but from the sheer force of clarity that had just swept through like a controlled demolition. Truth had been spoken, not in anger, not in haste, but with the kind of precision that leaves no room for misunderstanding. James Carter didn't turn away from Mike Dunham. He didn't blink. He simply stepped back, just enough to address the entire room now. Every badge, every pair of eyes, every uniform that suddenly felt heavier on its wearer's shoulders. He spoke again. Not loud, but with finality. Effective immediately, Officer Dunham is suspended. Pending a full internal investigation. A sharp inhale cut through the air. Somewhere near the back of the room, a pen dropped. Dunham stiffened like he'd been struck, though no hand had been raised. His mouth opened slightly as if to object, but the words never formed. He looked around the room, but the eyes that met his now weren't laughing. They weren't proud. They weren't loyal. They were afraid, not of James Carter, but of the era that had just begun. James let the declaration hang. No theatrics. No pleasure, just the steady weight of something long overdue. "This is not about vengeance," he said. "This is not punishment for the sake of punishment." He stepped forward again, his voice now slightly firmer, not angry, but commanding. "This is a resetting of standards, a recalibration of what it means to wear this badge. Because if we don't protect the dignity of the people we serve, we have no business wearing the uniform at all." That line landed differently. Not a threat, but the truth made breathing harder. James looked around slowly now, locking eyes, not to intimidate, but to remind. "You want to keep laughing at the expense of those we're sworn to protect?" he asked. "Then this is not the department for you." He paused again. "But if you're ready to be better, then we start today." It wasn't a plea. It was a line in the sand, and the officers in the room knew it. You could feel the shift, subtle yet seismic. The cocky grins had vanished. The leaned-back chairs were now rigid. For the first time in a long time, no one looked to Dunham to see how to react. They looked at James Carter, and more importantly, they listened. Because leadership wasn't wearing the loudest voice in the room anymore. Leadership had just walked in, calm as a storm front, and it wasn't here to ask permission. It was here to change everything. When the meeting ended, no one spoke. The usual clatter of chairs and light-hearted chatter never came. Officers filtered out slowly, avoiding each other's eyes, as if afraid to touch the smoke still hanging in the room. Mike Dunham stormed out, jaw clenched, face burning with a color that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with exposure. His boots thudded against the linoleum like accusations. But James Carter didn't move from the podium. He watched it all, quietly cataloging everything. The body language, the silence, the distance between former allies. The culture had been cracked. Now came the task of breaking it wide open. Back in his office, James dropped the folder onto his desk. It landed with a weighty thud, as if it too understood what it now represented. He didn't sit, not yet. He picked up the phone and dialed Internal Affairs. "I want everything you have on Officer Dunham," he said, his tone flat and razor-sharp. "Not the official summaries, not the sanitized reports. I want everything. Complaints, incident logs, disciplinary notes, witness statements. You have 24 hours." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Understood, Chief." James hung up. Then he sat down, slowly, deliberately. He had expected pushback. What he hadn't expected was how quickly the wall began to crumble. That afternoon, a knock tapped at his door. Not loud, but uncertain. It was Officer Elena Reyes, a junior patrol officer, who was 3 years old. Her posture was straight, but her eyes were tired, not from lack of sleep, but from years of keeping her mouth shut. "Chief," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "can I speak to you off the record?" James nodded. "Of course. Come in." She stepped inside, closed the door, and took a deep breath, like someone surfacing after being underwater too long. "I saw what happened in the hallway this morning," she said, "and I'm ashamed I didn't say anything." James didn't interrupt. He just listened. "Dunham, he's been like that for years. Not just with you, with civilians, with us. And we all knew. We laughed along because it was safer than becoming the next target." Her hands trembled, but her voice, it grew stronger with each word. "But after what you said, what you did, I don't want to be part of that silence anymore." James leaned forward, folded his hands, and nodded once. "That's all I ask," he said softly. "The silence ends here." Reyes exhaled sharply. A release years in the making. She wasn't the last to come forward. By the end of the week, more officers knocked on that same door, some with hesitation, some with relief, all carrying the truth they had been forced to bury. And as the internal investigation began to unravel years of protected misconduct, one thing became clear. The rot hadn't started with Mike Dunham, but with him gone, the system finally had space to heal. The sanctuary of Emmanuel Baptist Church was filled with soft light and softer voices. Gospel chords floated gently from the old piano, mixing with the aroma of sweet bread and wood polish. It was the kind of Sunday morning where faith was more about survival than ceremony. James Carter sat quietly near the back, not in uniform, not with a speech. Just a man in a pew listening. He didn't come to be seen. He came to be present. Word had spread about the meeting, the suspension, and the quiet shifts rippling through Little Pines PD. Some had celebrated. Others had grumbled behind closed doors. But most people here in this church don't celebrate headlines anymore. They waited to see if the change would knock on their doors, if it would protect their sons. After the benediction, people began to filter out, some nodding politely in his direction, others still unsure what to make of him. And then came the boy. He was maybe 8, maybe 9. Skinny frame, big eyes, nervous steps. He stopped 2 feet in front of James, twisting the hem of his shirt between his fingers. "Are you really the police chief?" he asked. The words came out small but steady. James smiled, not the kind of smile for photographs, the kind that meant he understood what was really being asked. "I am," he said gently. "Why do you ask?" The boy looked down, then up, then down again. My dad said the police don't protect us. The sentence didn't carry anger. It carried history. It carried the weight of backseat conversations, of doors locked faster when cruisers passed, of names whispered during the news at dinner. It carried the bitter taste of generational warning, passed from father to son like armor. James felt the truth of it, not just in the words, but in the space that followed. The space that only exists when trust is something that has to be earned back, not simply claimed. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself eye level with the boy, not above him, with him. "What your dad said, I understand," James began, "and I can't change what happened before. I can't undo what hurt you or what made your dad feel like that." The boy watched him closely now. "But I promise you this, starting now, you will be heard. You matter. Your family matters. And if you ever feel scared or unsure or need someone to listen, you come find me." The boy blinked, then slowly nodded. Just once, a small smile broke across his face, the kind of smile that doesn't come from being convinced, but from being seen. James stood, placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, and watched him run back toward his mother's side. And in that quiet church hallway, without a press release or a camera in sight, a promise had been made. Not to a crowd, but to the future. Change didn't come in fireworks. It came in footsteps. Some were loud, the sound of boots leaving. The officers who rolled their eyes at new standards, who scoffed at trainings on civil rights, who grumbled about softening the job. They didn't stay long. They weren't pushed out. They simply couldn't breathe in the atmosphere James Carter was building, an atmosphere where fear no longer passed for authority, where silence was no longer protection. So they walked, and no one stopped them. In their place came new recruits. Younger, yes, but more than that, aware of the weight of the badge, of the meaning behind each knock on a stranger's door, of the fact that the right to serve doesn't come from a uniform, but from earning trust, over and over again. They didn't come to be warriors. They came to be guardians. At first it was subtle, an officer stepping out of the cruiser to walk a child across the street, a patrol woman kneeling beside an elderly man who'd dropped his groceries, a rookie asking a citizen, "Do you feel safe with us?" and meaning it. But the most powerful symbol of all wasn't in the briefings or the reports. It was in the hallway. Because James Carter was always there. Every morning, every shift change. Every slow Wednesday and every tense Friday night. He didn't hover. He didn't lecture. He stood, right by the bulletin board, arms folded. Sometimes with coffee in hand, sometimes just nodding to each officer who passed, a living message that accountability wasn't a moment, it was a rhythm. Some called it performative, until they realized he never missed a day. It wasn't performance. It was presence. And in time, that presence rewrote the unwritten rules of the department. People looked each other in the eye more. They asked harder questions in meetings. They stopped using silence as a shield. The locker room jokes changed, or vanished altogether. The break room became less about division, more about conversation. And for those who stayed, who embraced the shift, James was more than a chief. He was a mirror. Every hallway he stood in reminded them who they said they were. And every day he showed up, he silently asked, "Are you living up to the badge today?" Not everyone answered aloud, but every decent officer heard it. And every dishonest one felt it, because sometimes the most radical reform in a corrupt system is simply a man who refuses to look away. The laughter was still there. It rose from the break room in soft waves, lighter now, no longer the kind that curled around someone's back. no longer the kind that left bruises in the silence afterward. This laughter didn't carry a victim. It carried balance. Inside the squad room, a young officer cracked a joke about paperwork, and the entire table chuckled, not at someone, but with each other. A civilian liaison stopped by with donuts, and no one made snide remarks about community babysitters. Even the radio chatter felt less tense. Like a house where windows had finally been opened after too many years shut tight. James Carter stood in the hallway. Same spot. Same posture, arms folded, back straight. A quiet sentinel beneath the flickering overhead light. He didn't smile, but he didn't need to. Because the silence inside him had shifted too. He had come to Little Pines not to be liked, but to be honest. Not to inspire fear, but to remove it. And now, months later, he stood among officers who nodded at him with something real. Not obligation, not performance, but acknowledgement. They didn't always agree with him. Some still whispered doubts. Some still questioned change, but no one laughed the way they used to, and that mattered more than any memo. No one clapped when James walked past. No one built a plaque or named a room after him. But every time an officer checked themselves before speaking, every time a citizen filed a complaint and knew it would be heard, every time a young black boy in town saw a cruiser and didn't flinch, that was the applause. That was the reward. The hallway echoed softly with the rhythm of boots on tile as the shift change began. Officers passed him with nods, some with a quiet, "Morning, Chief." A few, those who once looked through him, now met his gaze directly. Not out of fear, but out of growth. One officer, the same rookie who'd once kept silent during Dunham's tirade, offered him a fresh cup of coffee on the way out. James took it with a small nod. No words, just heat in his hands and something settled in his chest. This wasn't a fairy tale. The department wasn't perfect, and the world outside still carried its weight. But here, in this hallway, this artery of a once diseased heart, the blood had begun to move differently. Change, he knew, doesn't arrive with banners or brass bands. It arrives in rituals repeated, in wrongs not repeated, and sometimes the greatest sign of progress is what no longer happens. So James Carter stood there, not for applause, not for history, but for the officers still becoming who they needed to be, and for the people who, at long last, might finally believe in the badge again. Not every revolution begins with a shout. Some begin with silence and an unyielding stare. If you have ever been ignored, if you have ever been silenced, this story is yours, and it is your turn to speak up.